Okay, welcome everybody. Hopefully this is all working as we balance a lot of different tech that doesn't really completely work together, but we're gonna try and make it work. So welcome. Today we are demoing RetopoFlow 2. I'm here with Jonathan Denning, my co-creator of RetopoFlow. I'm Jonathan Williamson. And really what we're gonna do is basically walk through, as I try and manage too many different windows, we're going to walk through, number one, what RetopoFlow is, how it works, what's different between this and version 1, and kind of most importantly, I am going to attempt to retopologize this object live, and we'll see how far we get. So first of all, for anyone that is unaware or perhaps not quite sure, RetopoFlow is a retopology tool. Retopology meaning that we take a high-resolution source object, such as this robo-sphere that was created by Kent Trammell, and then retopologize it to create a smooth representation of the same surface, but with optimal geometry. So whereas in this mesh, if you look closely, it'll be a little hard to see in the video, but basically you can see that this is a dynamic topology mesh such that it's created of lots and lots of little triangles. And if you wanted to do anything with this mesh, such as assign different materials for these different indents, maybe set this circular part to be a dark metal or even like a glowing light or something like that, you'd have a really hard time doing it. In addition, if you were working with, say, an organic model, like a character or something like that, it would be almost impossible to rig, much less texture and animate a character model that's sculpted like this. And sculpting is basically the reason that retopology has become such an important part of everybody's workflow. And honestly, it is why RetopoFlow exists as a tool. Because what's happened in the last few years as tools and workflows have changed is that basically sculpting has gotten to be such a good tool for artists specifically that we're able to create just about any model you want, be it organic or hard surface, with sculpting tools. And this is very much like painting. It's like sculpting in clay. It's a much more artistic process. Whereas the traditional modeling techniques, using box modeling and things like that, were a very technical and manual process where you were constantly filling faces, connecting edges, and you were constantly working on the mesh itself. So as dynamic topology and sculpting in general have become the preferred choice for highly detailed models, we've had a need to enable retopology, to recreate that detailed surface with optimal geometry. And that's where RetopoFlow comes in. So first of all, I should say that I actually have a course here on CG Cookie on the introduction to retopology if you want to learn more about that. And it walks you through how to retopologize a model using nothing but Blender's default tools. And Blender's default tools are really, really good modeling tools. The problem with them is that they're not really designed with retopology in mind, in that there are ways to get everything to snap to a surface using either the shrink wrap modifier or face snapping, but nothing works inherently for retopology. There's a lot of things that you want to happen when you're doing retopology, specifically in that you want everything to conform to the surface. If you've got this high-res sculpted model and you create a row of faces over it, you want to just know that it's conforming to that surface. And so that's basically where we came in. So we decided to build an add-on. Originally it was called Contours, and we built a single tool, and then we built a second tool called Polystrips, and then we discovered that, hey, these tools should work together, so we merged them. And after a while, we finally released RetopoFlow. That was 2 years ago, and now we've spent the last 2 years building RetopoFlow 2. And RetopoFlow 2, personally, I feel is what RetopoFlow was always meant to be. It is finally at the point where I can't speak for John, but I am personally proud of where it has come and what it finally is. And for the first time, I feel like I'm happy to show it up because it's a very complex add-on. John can probably speak to a little bit of the complexity behind how it's all working. I mean, in reality, we started out just wanting to build a little modeling add-on for Blender that made it easier to do retopology. fast forward to today, and we made an entire Retopology tool suite that just so happens to work in Blender. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and just basically jump right in. So what we have is we have this dynamic topology sculpt, and what we want to do is we want to recreate the surface. So in RetopoFlow, I'm in basically what we call RetopoFlow mode. Let me just leave it real quick and I'll show you how it starts. So basically I have this high-res source object. I open my toolbar, and we have the RetopoFlow add-on enabled, which then gives us all of these tools within the Retopology tab. We've got contours, polystrips, polypen, strokes, patches, loops, relax, and tweak. All of these basically will activate RetopoFlow mode. And soon as we do that, we will be placed within the previous UI that I showed you. So I'm just going to do this via the menu, just so I can hide the toolbar. So I'm just going to start with polystrips. Polystrips is a tool designed to basically lay down strips of polygons. And so what we have is we have this brush, just like sculpting. You can see it. It's a little hard to see over the model. If I make it really large, maybe you can see it a little better. But basically it works just like a sculpting brush in that we have a size that we can adjust with F. And then if we just simply hold down Control, we can left click and drag across the surface and lay down a strip of polygons. So this strip of polygons, and why it's called polystrips, is that this strip of polygons is now driven by a Bezier curve. So you'll see I've got an outer and an inner handle. So this outer handle, I can grab the end of the curve, and the inner handle, I can then adjust the overall path. And through this whole time, as I move this, everything is then snapping there to the surface. And this is really the entire basis of RetopoFlow, in that everything you do snaps the geometry to the surface. And this is kind of where what sets it apart beyond just the tools, what sets it apart from Blender's default tools is simply that the surface snapping is an inherent part of the workflow. So let me go ahead and delete that since I kind of made it a mess. And I'm going to just restart it. So, where you would use this tool is like along this nice long flowing curve. So if I just control click and drag, take it down, there we go, I can draw that. Now, at this point, it's just a strip of polygons. I can adjust the depth here. I might tweak this a little bit just to move it over here. Any one of these handles, I'm just using my left mouse button, and I can click and drag to adjust them. And each time it does reproject it to the view, so you will notice there's a little bit of skewing down here. But that's actually not a problem at all because there's a whole series of tools that make this really, really easy to fix. But let's say that, right now, I like this top section, but I really want to get this a little closer. So I just deselect everything with A, and now I just select this section by right-click and dragging, and now it's regenerated the Bezier curve based on my selection, and I can now modify this selection with the Bezier. And so it makes it really, really easy to go in and basically just precisely place your strips exactly like you want without having to worry about getting it perfect the first time. And this is one of the ways where 2.0 is very, very different than 1.x series, because in the 1.x series, basically the way that everything worked was, number one, they were all separate modes. So polystrips was its own mode, contours was its own mode, and all of them basically created fake geometry per se, in that if you drew this strip of this polystrip, it would be a dedicated strip with a curve that you would then have to commit after the fact. Once you committed it, you would return to edit mode and your mesh would be generated. But at that point, if you reactivated polystrips, all of that dynamic information would be lost, and you would have to basically recreate your strips, or else then work with quote-unquote permanent geometry. In RetopoFlow 2, everything is native geometry from the get-go, and all of our tools basically work on that geometry. So just to illustrate this, let me leave RetopoFlow. I'm going to select this edge. I'm just going to extrude it, and I will go ahead. I've got face snapping already on, and I'm just going to extrude. So I've created basically a strip of edges. Let me now go back into polystrips, and it does take just a moment to start because it has to go in and cache all of the unselected objects so that it knows what to snap everything to. So now I have these edges that I created in edit mode. I just right-click and drag and select them, and now I can modify them as a Bezier curve. And so any strip of quads is selectable and editable as a polystrip. I'm going to go ahead and just delete those faces. So let's go in here. Let's continue this around. So basically I want to create this geometry up here. So I'll adjust my brush size, and the brush size basically affects the width of the polystrip quads. And within polystrips, basically, whenever you draw your strip, everything is then equally divided such that it's trying to make square quads. And this is something that we do natively throughout all of RetopoFlow, is everything wants to be a square quad. And the reason for this is that if you want really nice, even geometry that deforms well and is consistent and renders smoothly, as a good rule of thumb, you want your quads to be square, such that they're not super stretched or anything like that. It improves your shading, it improves your deformation, and so that's what we use as a default. Now, you can override that and you can do all sorts of things to stretch them out. I can pull this way out and then I have a really long stretched quad, but by default, we want it to be nice and even. So I'll just draw this in, and that's a little big. I'm going to scale it down. So I'll draw this up, and in this time, I'm starting from the previous quad, and you'll notice that it automatically selected everything. Now in this case, my angle was really bad, so I'm just going to redraw that. We do have full undo and redo support, so you can very easily change things as you go. I'll rotate this around. And then let's bring one more in just like this. And you'll notice that right now, my mesh is actually pretty messy. And part of this is because I'm trying to actually talk somewhat coherently while also demonstrating it. But that's okay, because what we have, like I mentioned earlier, is a whole series of tools for cleaning this up. So let's go ahead and just demonstrate that. But before I do, one key thing that you'll notice is this model is symmetrical. So let's go ahead and enable symmetry. So here in this options panel right here, which these are draggable, by the way, so you can position them wherever you like. I'm just going to hit X for symmetry. And, oh, I crashed it. Hold on. We are bound to get a crash while live streaming and testing this. Unfortunately, one moment while I recover. John, feel free to chime in here.
I was just answering a few questions.
Excellent.
In the comments.
Okay, give me one moment. All right. We have found, for one reason or another, that the symmetry does tend to be a touch buggy. This isn't always clear as to why, but we will give me just a moment to reset this up. Unfortunately, this takes a moment to reset up. I've actually got Blender already back and active with everything started, but due to the nature of live streaming, all of my streaming presets have to then quickly be re-updated, and so that's what's taking me a second. Okay, there we go. I am now back, and this time I have symmetry actually on. Let me just recreate my surface, and John, if you see anything amiss, if I forgot to activate the stream, by all means, just say something.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. So now I recreate this. And now what I was trying to show you is that you'll notice that I have full symmetry enabled. So as I rotate around here, you can see the symmetry on the left side and on the right side. So what I want to now show is, first of all, we have full symmetry support in that if I'm looking at the back here, and I control click and drag and cut across, everything just snaps right to the symmetry line. If I do it again, snaps to the symmetry line, and again. If I disable symmetry and draw across, it will just let me draw straight through and then not cut anything if I re-enable it. So it works basically just like the clipping modifier, or the clipping option within the mirror modifier, because that's effectively what we're doing under the surface, is we're adding a mirror modifier to the geometry and then visualizing everything under the surface. I'm sure that that's not quite technically accurate, but that's John's realm, not mine. Okay. So I've laid down the first couple of strips. Let's now look at the relax and tweak tool, because this is where the cleanup comes in. So the relax tool is the first one. And then basically, I mentioned earlier that everything we're trying to do is a clean set of quads. Well, typically when you're modeling, you'll do lots of things like, you'll have strips of different sizes, you'll have big ones, you'll have little ones, you might even have some big ones connected to some little ones. And this is really, really common, particularly, if you're working on one area of a model. Let's say, I put a strip down like this, and then up here I've got these ones, and then I want to connect this here. Everything just connects, but everything is different sizes. This is just the nature of modeling, And so what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to go in and smooth these out really quickly. We want to be able to square up these faces, make them nice and even, distribute this a little bit better. And so this is where the relax tool becomes really key. So it also works like a brush. So in this case, using either the options bar over here, I can adjust the radius, the fall off, and the strength. I can also do that via my hotkeys of F, Shift F, and Control F. And so if I now just left click and drag across these, you notice that it basically immediately tries to square up most of these faces. And many of these are already square because it was an unmodified polystrip. So where you see it starting to have an effect is areas like where I crossed the symmetry line, where I connected a small strip to a large strip, that kind of thing. So let's first use the tweak tool. The tweak tool is very similar. It has the same strength, fall off, and radius options, just like a sculpt brush. But now this allows me to just move geometry around like this. And it's very helpful for both cleanup and for fixing things, but also in the scenario where I want to demonstrate the relax brush, but my mesh is too clean, it means I can also do this and then go back to the relax brush and smooth it out. And so what's really nice is that basically the entire thing works like sculpting. And that's actually one of the things that we have tried to do with RetopoFlow 2 is to treat it like sculpting, such that as an artist, sorry, I'm trying to adjust my view distance so that my zoom isn't quite so jumpy. As an artist, you shouldn't have to worry so much about the specific topology. Instead, you should worry about the flow of your mesh and making sure that everything has the density that you want, has the detail that you need, that has the overall structure, but not necessarily, is it nice and smooth or having to tweak vertex by vertex. And so what we're trying to do is basically give you a brush-like system for doing the retopology. All right, let's now move to the strokes tool really quick, because the strokes tool is where things really start to get interesting. And I'm going through these tools kind of in no particular order. The reason being is that when you're working within RetopoFlow or when you're doing retopology of any kind, you're going to jump around a lot. And this is one of the big things in 2.0 compared to 1.x is that you can jump around a lot. You can go use the polystrips for a little while, then you can jump into polypen, then fill a couple of holes with the patches, then relax everything, then jump back to contours. It's really, really nice in that it's the same way as a sculpting system where, when sculpting, you don't only work with the draw brush and then only work with the crease brush. But in previous versions, that's effectively what you had to do. So now you can just jump between them. But let's say that I want to fill this area right here. Well, basically what I want to do is I want to fill a quad here, and then basically bring them down like this to combine it. So this is where strokes comes in. With the strokes tool, I'm just going to right click and then shift right click to select these two edges. You notice I get a count of 2. And then over here, I'm just going to left click and drag while holding control between these two vertices. And, whoops, I've got 1, 2, 1, 2. Go between these two, and it will fill them in. If I then, let's say I go over here, I select these two, and I've got 2 edges here, and I just want to fill this area with a grid. I just draw across the symmetry line, and like that, it connects. Now in this case, I overshot my stroke, so it didn't merge the two. There we go. Merges just like that. If I switch back to relax just by pressing R, I can go smooth this area out, make that nice and clean. I can now say switch to the polypen tool because this edge here is kind of messed up. Oh, hold on. I got a crash. Welcome to the demo effect, everybody.
Just to kind of butt in for a little bit on that, anytime that you do see a crash, it does, hopefully you can see this little window that pops up that is allowing you to help us be able to fix these bugs. So it'll collect just some basic computer information, context of what was happening at the time. It does not include any Blender files or screenshots unless you want to. But there is a button that if you hit it, it will open up the GitHub issues page and allow you to be able to submit the information about it, let us know what happened, One thing that would be very helpful is if you can submit screenshots, tell us everything that you were doing, like what tools you're using beforehand. If you can submit a blend file, that would be excellent. I know some of you may not be able to, but submit as much information as you can, and we can only fix the bugs that we know about. So if you do happen to run into problems, let us know.
Yeah. All right, so I should be back now. In this case, I did just go ahead and restart RetopoFlow on the entire previously retopologized model that I created. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete it all, and we're going to look at it again. I am also, FYI, just so as far as performance goes, you will notice that my performance is a little slow because in order to get the screen sharing working, not only so John can follow along, but also so you guys can follow along, I'm screen sharing within our audio call system, Zoom, to John, where John and I are talking between video. OBS is then streaming my screen as well, and it's streaming the video and my video, and there's a lot of moving pieces. But it mostly works. All right, so just jumping back in, I've got a strip. The thing that I was attempting to demo beforehand is then the polypen tool. So let's say that I've got this area now. So I've got a strip down, and I want to go ahead and start filling in this area by hand. But let's say, okay, hold on a second. I know what's going on. I'm in the development branch. Hey, John, while I'm fixing this, why don't you talk a little bit about our development process and kind of what's gotten us to this point and kind of where we are now?
What's gotten us to the 2.0?
Okay, I figured it out. So, because I just updated my machine, all of my permissions for connecting to Git and things like that had to basically be re-authenticated. And due to that, every time that Blender would try and report an issue and connect to Git, it would log a 403 forbidden error, and thus it would get into an infinite loop while trying to cycle through, check that error. John, if you want to actually log that issue, we'll get that fixed.
Doing it now.
We'll bring this back in. Okay. Now we should be back. Hopefully, actually for good. All right, going back to the polypen tool. So what I was trying to do is basically, if you're filling this area, I showed polystrips earlier in that it's designed for laying down quick strips of geometry. But let's say that we want to fill in a very complicated area. And in fact, let's say that we want to fill in this area, which has, multiple different forms, and it's basically, it's complex. There's no clean way to fill this in dynamically. So there are times within every single model, whether you're doing a game model, a film model, you name it, where you want absolute control. You want to be able to create every quad, you want to be able to create every triangle, you want to be able to cut through things with a knife tool. That's where polypen comes in. Polypen basically works by allowing you to insert a vertex, extrude that vertex to an edge, and then convert that to a triangle. And then once that triangle is selected, which is automatically selected as you create it, if you insert another vertex, it turns into a quad, which then has two smart selections, basically automatically selecting the last two edges that were created, such that you can just start doing this. And so all I'm doing, I'm just holding down Control and then left click and dragging to place my vertex wherever I want it. And it gives me really fast control to basically just have very precise input over where my geometry goes, but it also gives me the ability to start cutting in things. So for example, let's say, on this case, I want to fill these edges. Well, polypen knows that if you have an edge selected and you hover over another edge while holding Control, it should just fill a quad because you don't need to do 2 clicks. So let's just do that. But in addition, since you just filled that, it also knows, or well, we make the assumption, and thus it knows, that you are trying to fill in basically a strip of quads here. So it just auto-selects the next open quad or next open edge adjacent to the face that you filled, so that you can do this, and then you can do this, and then you can do that. And everything is filled in and connected automatically. Now, here, I've made some funky geometry because I have this weird quad here, and I have this triangle here that I don't really want. I'd really like to just have, another edge coming down here. So, well, I just hold down Control, hovering over this edge, and you'll notice that it's highlighting the entire face and drawing in a new little triangle. So I just click, and it inserts that edge. So now I have an end gone. But with that edge, or that vertex now selected, because it's the last thing created, I continue to hold down Control, and hover over this edge, and I can cut through. And then I can cut through there. And then, since I have these two triangles, I just select that edge, hit X, and dissolve the edges. And now I've reworked that geometry flow pretty easily. I can go in and tweak things, so if I just select them and hit G, I can activate grab. But now I need to cut through for right here. So why don't I just, in this case, being a hard surface model, I don't care if there's the occasional triangle. So I'm just going to select this vertex. I'm going to hover over here, left click right there, and then left click there, and left click there, and left click there. And you'll notice, if you remember, that everything in RetopoFlow is surface snapped by default, such that even though that face was underneath the surface, you could see it cutting through earlier. If I undo this, you can see the face is cutting through the surface. That's okay, because every new cut that I add snaps right to the surface, and I have this nice, perfect, clean mesh. I can go in and tweak it any more that I want, or I can do, whatever else we want to do. So let's say that we want to start connecting down this area. I previously showed you the strokes tool for a moment, but this is kind of the perfect area to demonstrate it, because really what I want to happen is I want to select these edges, and I want to basically just extrude them down right here. But I want to do it in one step. So I'm going to switch to the stroke tool with these edges selected. I'm just going to left click and drag while holding down Control to about the distance of my edge and a nice curve, and there we go. In this case, this might be a few too many fills, so I'm just going to decrease that down to 1. A good common rule of thumb is to keep everything as simple as possible in terms of your geometry count before you fill, or before as you're, let me rephrase that. A good rule of thumb is to keep your geometry as simple as possible while retopologizing. There we go. Because you can always, if your mesh is nice and clean and you've got good topology flow that follows your forms and your details and your isolating areas well, you should be able to add more density to your mesh at any time without much trouble. And so this is one of the things that people will tend to run into, is you start getting lots of cascading loops where they're like, you select a loop around the bridge of the eyes and it goes all the way down the head, down the neck, around the arms and through the shoulders. And that's what you're trying to avoid. That's part of good topology, and that's honestly where the skill comes in and the practice. That kind of stuff becomes second nature after a while, and ideally, as a pitch, you shouldn't have to fight your tools while trying to do that. And your tools shouldn't crash, but it's the demo effect, so it's okay. We're not ashamed of it. Let's continue using the stroke tool. So the stroke tool basically has 3 modes of filling of sorts. Number 1, if we have nothing selected and we just control click and drag across here, it'll insert edges. And it inserts those vertices spaced apart based on your brush size. So if you use a large brush and you draw across, oops, there we go. If you have a large brush, it'll make really large edges. If you have a tiny brush, it'll make a very dense edge. And anything that you have selected, it will attempt to either fill or extrude from. So in this case, since I have a row of edges selected and I control click and drag, it's going to just extrude from that, estimating the segments based on the size of your, I believe it based on the size of the brush, but it may just be evenly dividing it into quads. But immediately after drawing that, if I just hit shift up and down arrow, I can adjust those segments to then fit my needs. But let's say that we want to, go in and fill these areas. One of the things that makes an area like this difficult to fill in most cases is that this is going to be pretty even, but at all different points I have different widths for this detail. Here they're going to be nice and spaced apart. Here the edges are getting tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, and then it spreads back out again. So this is a perfect scenario for the strokes. So first thing I want to do is I want to fill this area because I want to bring 2 quads out. So I'm just going to select that edge up here, draw out from the bottom one, and it will fill that. Then I'll reselect these 2 edges, and I'm just going to go up here and draw from top to bottom, and it will extrude that, decrease the density, something like that. I'll extrude it again, adjust the density, and then all of these strips in here that I really didn't need, I'm just going to switch to the polystrip tool, hit Control, right click, and it will basically do a face loop selection. So I'll just delete those, get them out of there, so then I can actually continue on Let me adjust my zoom depths. There we go. All right, so we're going to continue here. So let's say now, let's do a slightly more complicated fill. Let's set our brush strength on the strokes, and we're going to draw out a stroke from this vertex all the way up along this edge. So, oh, I did just get a warning, FYI, that my internet connection is unstable, so hopefully that doesn't become a problem. But we're going to control click and drag. Draw. By the way, John, if there's any questions in the chat that are appropriate, chime in anytime, and I'll be happy to answer them too.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that has now extruded out, and it's connected to that vertex. I can hit Control to readjust my stroke just ever so slightly. But then what I really want is I want to fill this entire area following this nice curved silhouette. So with this selected, I'm just going to draw out from this vertex here. And basically what's going to happen is it's going to detect that there's these two edges here that are connected to my fill, and it's going to basically attempt to bridge this stroke with the stroke that I lay down. So I control click and drag from here, draw all the way out, and right about now is the point where I get nervous, hoping that it works correctly how I think it will, and there we are. So in well, I guess in two strokes, 1 and 2, I've now filled this whole section with a nice curve to it, and all I have to do to clean it up is switch to the tweak brush with T, tweak these vertices just a little bit, and we can move on from there. So that's where the stroke tool is really, really handy for filling those areas. But I can also do it for complex areas like this. So let's say I've got this guy. I control click on that edge, and it's going to do an edge loop selection to basically select from one corner down to the next corner. And I can then just draw out from this edge here, like this, or this vertex. I'm going to take this up, and this is not the smoothest thing to do with a mouse. It's a good point for a tablet. Draw it out like that, and it extrudes the whole thing. If I switch to the relax brush, just left click and drag across these, it'll smooth them right out. It does not detect the corner here, but you'll notice that I just happened to place it well enough that it just kind of worked. There we go. Makes that very easy to fill. All right, let's now switch to, I'm going to kind of fill in an area. I'm going to work on this area because I want to demonstrate the patches tool. So to do this, I'm going to start by mapping out a little bit of my surrounding topology. Specifically, I'm going to put in kind of an arc across here, and I want to fill this section. So I've got my brush size. I'm going to set my brush to basically match my surrounding geometry. So if you see these faces here, I'm just kind of match that. And so I'm just going to control click and drag down like this. There we go. That might be a little bit big. So if you hold control shift and left click and drag on your inner handles, you can actually scale them down. I'll bring it in, adjust my arc a little bit on these, scale this one down just a touch. And maybe, I don't know if my estimate is quite right. Let's see, we've got 5 faces here. If I right click and drag down here, we've got 5. So basically we're going to fill straight across here. And the way this is going to work is I'm going to use the patches tool, and I'm going to right click, shift right click, shift right click, shift right click, and shift right click. You'll notice that 2 of my vertices have big yellow circles on them, and this means that they're being detected as corners. And so now if I control shift right click here, it'll auto select these, and now I have 4 corners and a pre-visualized patch for bridging this. Now right now these are long rectangular patches, so if I hit shift up arrow, I can increase the density, say something like that, and that looks good. So I'm just going to hit F, or yeah, hit F to fill. All right, but here is where it starts getting a little different. Since I have this corner here, basically what I want to happen is I want this face loop here, like this, to continue up and around. But this vertex is kind of, well, often in a way that angle is not going to work very well. So I'm just going to grab my tweak brush, and I'm just going to pull these down just a touch. Everything stays snapped to the surface. I'm not worried about this intersection here with the corner because I'm going to fill that in a moment with a nice clean fill. So let's actually use the strokes tool for this. I'm going to grab this, this whole edge here, and I'm going to draw out from this one, just like this, all the way out to about here. Let that extrude out, and then using my polypen tool, I'm just going to grab this vertex, hover over this one, left click, and it will merge those together. So now what I've created within my geometry is basically this corner where I have this nice grid fill, this nice grid fill, these ones can actually come down a little bit using my tweak brush. I can relax those to kind of square them back up. And then in order to get this nice ridge, all I'm going to do is switch to the loops tool. I'm going to hover over this, hold down control, and left click. It'll cut in a loop. And then I'm going to reposition those just using the tweak brush again. I can get this one, basically get one nice line going all the way down, maybe down to there. And then if I actually switch back to loops, I can right click and drag, select these ones, hit S to slide them, slide that right up, and take these. And the other thing that you'll notice as I'm sliding these, it's not quite as obvious on a model like this, but the really important thing here is that all of these things like loop slides and whatnot are not being, with the exception of polystrips, the surface snapping is not being a projection from the view. It's actually projecting down to the source based on your normals. In other words, if I go, let's say I go like this, and I insert a new loop here, these bottom ones will still be snapped nicely. So if I cut that in, you notice that's nice and snapped. That's something that you simply cannot do with face snapping by default in Blender, because face snapping works based on the view, in that basically if I cut in something like this and then hold down control to snap it to the face, it's snapping from the view such that everything gets projected onto a flat surface. Whereas in this case, it's basically projecting from the surface, and so at any angle, it will continue to work. And that becomes really important when you're doing things like arms and you want to add a new loop all the way down. Here, I can just add another loop, right like that, and then select just these ones. Oops, getting a little overambitious with my loop. Slide that down, and I've got a nice solid surface there. All right, let's do some more here. So let's just take this. We're gonna draw that around, scale this down, and I'm gonna attempt to just kind of work a little quickly now just to make some progress. John, if you want to pick a couple of questions from the chat we can discuss. And of course, if there's no questions, that's fine.
So far, there's just been a few of them that I've actually been able to answer in mine.
Oh, nice.
If I happen to have missed one, maybe ask it again up at the top.
Yeah, and as a recommendation for anybody watching and listening, if you have a question, the best way to get it noticed, because I know that live stream chats can get a little active, is prefix it with question in all caps. It just makes it a lot easier for us to see as the stream goes screaming by. All right, so I'm going to take that.
There is one question about when will the tutorials for RetopoFlow 2 come out?
As soon as I find some way to fit in the time. I'm basically working on the outlines now and trying to get it done. You know, I don't want to make any promises, but I'll just tell you soon, and as soon as I can. Obviously, I recognize that, you know, RetopoFlow 2 is a massive change from the previous one, and so if you use any of the previous tutorials, you know, basically nothing is relevant anymore, and that's, yeah, nothing is relevant within the previous documentation or previous tutorials. So we have our work cut out for us in doing new training.
Mm-hmm. There was another question about having RetopoFlow not be necessarily depend on Blender, so that, you know, as Blender updates, especially with like 2.8 changing some things, or for people that are maybe not familiar with Blender, you know, how would they be able to use RetopoFlow?
Well, so right now, it depends absolutely on Blender, in that basically all of the mesh drawing, basically everything is working through the Blender API. There's a whole lot of things that are not Blender specific that we're doing, you know, in that like all of the snapping algorithms and stuff like that. That's mostly all custom, and that's all John's realm. But in short, what we are currently looking at is the prospect of doing a standalone RetopoFlow for exactly that reason. You know, because at this point, I don't think we ever really intended to take RetopoFlow this far. Like, it's definitely exceeded what we originally set out to do.
You've always pushed for this.
Well, to a degree, yes. But basically, it's, what we've become aware of is simply that it is far more extensive now than maybe we were expecting to get. And a part of that means that we realize that there's a lot of value to RetopoFlow outside of the Blender ecosystem. In the same, oops, I need to. So one thing real quick that you notice, as I was relaxing this, you notice it's pulling away from the symmetry line. And so to fix that, all I need to do is in the relax options here, I just enable boundary, and that way it won't pull away. And now I can just relax all along the boundary. And it won't slide along the boundary, which, by the way, John, actually would be really nice if we allowed verts to slide along the boundary, just not pull away from it. So that makes it a lot easier to not mess up your symmetry line every time. But in short, to go back to the question, we are considering a standalone RetopoFlow. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves, because our first and foremost goal has always been to build, compelling retopology tools for Blender and for Blender specifically. That's how we got started, and we've always been Blender people. As the project has progressed, though, it's become pretty compelling, and we kind of like the idea more and more. Not as a, there's nothing about Blender in that discussion that is, that Blender's a problem. It's simply that, wouldn't it be kind of cool if we could bring this to everybody? And the only real answer in our thoughts is that means it has to be standalone. Whether or not we will actually do that, of course, remains to be seen. There's a lot of things that can happen between now and then, but that is the thought. Oh, okay. I wanted to show this area in particular. So one of the things, for anybody that's been around Blender for a while, you may remember that when grid fill got added, everybody was so excited because basically capping cylinders with a nice quad only mesh was something that just was a royal pain, and that it was a pain. So if you wanted to cap an area like this, it just took a lot of work and you had to do it manually. So we decided to basically use a grid fill system to make that a little simpler. So what I'm first going to do, number one, you'll notice if in the strokes tool I've selected this whole ring. We have 22 vertices. This is key. I guess that's 22 edges, not vertices. This is key, of course, if we want a nice even grid fill. So I'm just going to extrude this in. There is, we don't have an option to basically extrude and scale. This is one area where Blender's extrude and scale is maybe a little superior, but this is going to get cool in a moment. So I'm going to use my stroke tool. I'm just going to draw a circle here. See, this is actually where, because I have a mouse and I have a very unsteady hand, you'll notice my circle is perfect. It's totally perfect. There is no waviness to it, but we can extrude with the loop tool in a nice circular manner, and then simply, sometimes relax will do funky things in this case. So I'm just going to use my tweak brush just to move this around a little bit. One thing that we are needing to figure out within the strokes tool for something like this is how to designate a start and end point to your draw. But also, there's also an option here. If we just enable selected, tweak will only, that's inversed. Here we go. It'll only move the selected geometry if I hold down shift. And so it makes it easy just to ignore my other geometry. But what I was saying within the stroke tool, the thing that we have to figure out is that in some scenarios, such as this, where we have a non-uniform distribution of vertices around the circle, is how to designate a start and end point such that everything doesn't get skewed. That is definitely, on our list, and I did see John looking down, taking notes. So that typically means good things. By the way, just for anybody that is considering it, I highly recommend hiring a Python coder if you're doing Blender tools, because it's awesome when you say something and then a couple hours later is like, hey, try this. All right, so I brought that in, and now I'm going to use the patch tool. So basically, I want a grid patch. So I'm going to go and select these. So I've got, let's say, there's 6 here. One nice thing, this is totally just a small touch. You'll notice I got an extra edge selected here. Doesn't matter. Patches will just completely ignore it because it's a closed face. All right, so there's a patch. If I increase my count, Nope, I'm going to deselect that edge. I'm going to add that one to my selection. And that will fill, that will fill. Let's go ahead and just fill that. All right. And then using the polypen tool, I'm just going to fill that like that, 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 and there. And then I can, I can fill this any number of ways. Maybe I just add another loop here. And then I fill this. That may not be perfect, but it'll totally work for now. I don't have an even grid fill here, which actually is going to bother me a lot. And if I weren't trying to do this live and actually be thinking about what I'm doing, I would fix that. All right. I'm going to just basically keep working through this area. So I'm not going to use the stroke tools again. I'm just going to draw this down just like that. For anybody that's noticed, you'll notice the one thing that I haven't used yet is I have not touched contours. And that is specifically because this model doesn't really need it. And so actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this and I'm going to open up our Viking sculpt model from Kent so that I can demo that specifically, because actually contours is the tool that started this whole thing. But before I do that, a couple of notes. In the original version, one of the issues that people ran into was if you crashed, you lost your work. If you hit escape too early, you lost your work. If you looked at it the wrong way, you lost your work. That's no longer the case. Number one, if you hit escape, you exit RetopoFlow, and all of your mesh is already generated because we're working natively within geometry. Secondly, the entire time that we are working, as soon as this restarts back up, if you look under the Advanced tab and then go under Autosave, you'll discover that we're actually doing an autosave every 120 seconds. And so at any point in time, you can go in and recover that autosave up to 120 seconds ago at the absolute max. And if you dive into the Python code, you can actually change this. You could make it every 5 seconds if you wanted. Your computer might hate you, but you could do it.
That's based off of the autosave setting in your user preferences.
Oh,
so if you
there you go.
There, then it will.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, good to know. Even better than that, though, is at any point you can just hit Save Now, and it will save your current file. Or it's not quite obvious, but if you hit Control-W, which is the save hotkey in Blender, it will also save your file at any point. So if I just, let's say I do this, I move this guy way up here, make a mess, save my file, and then load up a new Blender file, reopen that, and there we go, it's saved. So at any point, you can basically save your work and keep going. And in most cases, all of your work has already been saved, even if you weren't paying attention. So in this case, if I just click File, Recover Autosave, you'll see RetopoFlow Backup, and there it is. So let me jump over to the Viking sculpt here. And I have a lot of different files here. Okay, so here's the Viking sculpt. I'm going to activate polystrips on this. A quick thing to note is that 100% of this Retopology was done in RetopoFlow. And it was done, I didn't record it, but I believe it was done in about 30 to 40 minutes. And that was me just basically stress testing it and experimenting and seeing what I could do. So let me just hide that. I'm going to reactivate. And I'm going to demo the Contours tool. So the Contours tool, still to this day, is probably my favorite thing, mostly because it's what started this, and it's fast and satisfying, because the way that it works, you hit Contours, you hold down Control, you left-click and drag across a cylindrical form, and you just do this. Whee! And that's all done. Now, right now, it's messy because, well, I just kind of haphazardly did it. But you can now go in, you can grab the loop, you can slide it down along the surface, and again, it stays snapped to the surface from all angles, not just from the view. You can rotate the loop, you can shift the loop around, you can cut in new loops, like that. You can select them, rotate, select. You can delete them, you can dissolve them, and you can extrude new ones, like this. Whoops, like that. And then if you have an open section like this that you want to fill, just select the two and hit F, which is actually a feature that had always intended to be there literally from day one, and we just hadn't gotten to it because it proved a little more complicated than perhaps we thought it would be. And which is really basically the lesson for this entire project is, does it sound simple? It's not. There we go. Now, there's one big upgrade here. Oops, my cursor is off. Hold on. Actually, I'm going to show you something. Okay, so this is bound to happen to somebody because we've already gotten questions about it. I enabled symmetry here, and you notice my symmetry line is right here. It's right down his left side. This is a fundamental aspect of Blender that maybe just doesn't seem obvious when you're actively in RetopoFlow because lots of Blender is hidden. But RetopoFlow, just like every other object in Blender, uses the 3D cursor as your starting position for a new object. And so if you have no object selected when you start RetopoFlow, it will create a new source or a new target object. And so it's going to create that object at the location of the 3D cursor, as it just did for me, and thus your symmetry line is off. So all we do to fix it, select your source object or whatever you want your center line to be, recenter your 3D cursor, select your new object, and hit Control-Alt-Shift-C and choose Origin to 3D Cursor, and then it jumps right back over. Because under the surface, if I get out of full screen mode, let's see if I can remember how to do that within, well, if I weren't in full screen mode within Blender.
Alt F10 is.
Yeah, that's, oh, there it is, Alt F10, that's. So under the surface, literally all we've done is added a mirror modifier. So that's why if your object origin is off, or the 3D cursor is, somewhere way over here whenever you start RetopoFlow, your symmetry line will be off. So it becomes an easy fix if you know what you're looking for. So jumping back into polystrips, and we do have another we'll give it another like 15, 20 minutes before we start to wind down and call it a day. So by all means, now is your chance to get additional questions in. So this is the other thing that I wanted to show you really quick within contours is the number one thing contour-wise that has happened in 2.0 is this. Whoops. So you can now use contours along the symmetry line to do things like torsos, and basically, what's happening is you're basically creating a C, and that C is then being mirrored to create your entire loop. And this has made contours infinitely more valuable because there's just so many more scenarios that you can use to contour. And so, we can go in here and cut this. We can cut this. One thing that we are hoping to add support for is adjusting the segments on an entire cylindrical section. So like this whole arm is to be able to adjust these segments after the fact, just like we currently can with polystrips, which I guess maybe I didn't actually show you. Within polystrips, if you have a stroke and then you have another stroke and you go back and reselect a portion of that stroke, you can adjust those segments at any time, even if that stroke was created outside of RetopoFlow, which is pretty sweet. So we delete that, we can go in and just connect this here, decrease those strokes, bring this up, take a stroke up like that, increase those, that maybe went a little far. And now for these last few minutes, I've basically somewhat demoed everything that I intended to demo, including things I didn't intend to demo, like crash functionality and trying to recover. But now I'm just going to do a little work.
There was a question about how many what was it? How many objects can you retopologize?
Technically, any amount. We don't. Correct me if I'm wrong, John. We don't have a set limit within the code base for how many objects can be used as sources at one time. Obviously, it's not recommended that you do lots and lots and lots of objects, because the more objects you do and the higher poly count it is, the more intense the resources will be in terms of the resources needed to perform everything. but there's nothing stopping you from doing it. The only thing really stopping you is the performance of your machine. Typically what we recommend is that you retopologize, a couple objects at a time. And so I think I mentioned it earlier, but basically the way that it works is any unselected object is your source. So in this case, if you look in wireframe mode, my high-res sculpt is my source, and so I leave it unselected. I select my target object, or if I don't have a target object yet, then I don't select anything, and then you start RetopoFlow. You will see, if you open the toolbar, there is the target name, RetopoFlow 0.001. So that is the object that it has created automatically to act as the source, or sorry, as the target. And so then any visible object that is unselected will be added into your source. So if you have, overlapping sculpts, maybe you're sculpting the head and the body as separate pieces, but want to retopologize it as a single cohesive one, that works great. If you have clothing attached to the model that you want to retopologize, again, all as one, such as like if you're doing a game model, that all works. It's just, just be cognizant of how much you're trying to ask of your machine. RetopoFlow is a fairly intensive process in that we're doing a lot of mesh drawing to keep everything above the surface. So it's not going to be as fast as Blender's native modeling tools, for one, because it's all done in Python, but also just because we're doing a lot. So one thing that you can do as, just recommendations for speeding things up is, if you can, what's the word I'm looking for? Decimate your high-res sculpts prior to starting will help a lot. Because one of the nice things when you're retopologizing is you really don't care about all the teeny tiny details in your surface. The only thing you care about are those details that contribute to the silhouette, or the big details that you need for following on your mesh flow. Like on this model, this was sculpted by Kent Trammell, by the way, is when he first gave it to me, it was super high res, and it was probably like 1.5 million triangles or something. And I went ahead and decimated it using Blender's decimate modifier and took it down to something like 120,000 triangles or 200,000 triangles. I don't remember. I dropped it by, I think it was 80%. And it lost some surface details. It lost all the really nice details that he had sculpted in. But in terms of the form and the overall structure, I didn't lose anything. But I got a massive performance boost out of it. And decimating that model, took 5 minutes. It was a very easy kind of pre-processing step that I could do to ensure better performance and literally, zero loss overall. So here I'm just kind of haphazardly doing this. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. There we go. See, this is where the strokes tool is just awesome. I will tell you, there's one section. If you're doing torso, or if you're doing character models like this, it is actually really recommended that you do a T-pose like this, because doing the armpit here with any Blender tool, RetopoFlow or otherwise, is really a pain. And so typically to do this section, what you would do is you would go into just regular Blender's edit mode, because in this case you don't want surface snapping, because, how are you going to designate which surface you're snapping to down here? You can do it. It just gets difficult and you can't really see what you're doing. So T-poses help with your visibility there. But of course, then it also challenges your deformation. One quick thing to add, this is something that will come up a lot, is you'll notice as I zoom in here, my mesh doesn't always draw on top. And this is very common. And basically what's happening is that our clipping start and end distance are not sufficiently set for our mesh visibility. We've done everything that we can within RetopoFlow to try and always draw the mesh on top of the surface, but because it's literally two pieces of geometry that are intersecting, there's only so much that we can do without completely messing up the drawing location of the geometry. We could of course raise this up off the surface kind of like a shrink wrap, but then your geometry is in the wrong place. So one of the things that we've done is we've exposed the view options here, where you can both adjust the lens focal distance on your camera so that you can get whatever focal distance you want, and you can adjust the clip start and end on the RetopoFlow mesh. And so as you get smaller and smaller, basically it'll bring things closer to the camera, or you should ignore my explanations of how this works because it's going to be wrong. But I can tell you what it feels like it's doing. And then the end. So basically, you can go in and adjust your start and end to tweak your drawing settings. So as you notice here, as I'm adjusting the end, I can start, like, these settings will start to disappear because this applies only to our target mesh that is being rendered, not so much everything behind it. Or actually, that's not true. It totally includes everything. John, maybe you can actually describe how this works other than how you use it. Basically, from the user standpoint, adjust your start and end and you can get better drawing.
Yes. It's a very technical thing. It has to do a lot with how your graphics card actually manages to draw things really quickly, but also in some ways to know what's in front and what's behind. So any video game that you play, when you're seeing three-dimensional things on the web in a web browser, and even in Blender, except for Eevee, I believe, you're always going to run into this problem. So they take some shortcuts, and one of them is to store a depth information, but you only have so much information you can store. And the clip start and end describe how far away you want to start storing information at the front and how far away at the back. That's the technical bit. And so if you spread this out really far so you can see really far into the distance, but also see really close, then you only have so many numbers that you can represent the depth in there. And so then you end up having things that show up on top of other things when it should be behind. It does all sorts of weird stuff. And then here, because we're working with low poly count target mesh, so your vertices are really far apart, and your source mesh may actually intersect, like Jonathan had said. It may go through your target mesh. Literally inside. The target is inside of the source. There's only so much that we can do. Now, if you put a vertex there, so you add an edge loop or use polypen to kind of poke in a few more things, then that vertex is going to be on the surface and it'll draw things properly. But anytime you have a strong curve and you have a very low polygon count target mesh that tries to approximate that curve, you're going to have bumps kind of poking through, which is what you see down in the shoulder area. So we try our best to do what we can. Sometimes our guesses aren't quite right, and so we're trying to give you access to some settings that may help improve the visualization.
There we go. Yeah, that mostly made sense in my mind. Mostly.
We have one question. I've been, they had asked, Yukino, I'm probably butchering the name, had asked about asking questions on Decimate, but said that I've been sculpting a model, and that model, I actually made it too smooth for my computer, but ended up saving it correctly. After I wanted to open it up, I could no longer do this because the computer keeps crashing, even waiting an hour and a half. So I was wondering if there is a mode in Blender, like here in RetopoFlow, that autosave for me that might be handy. I guess this is a Blender question.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the thing that I would try is actually, most of that data is probably there. It could be that you have multiple copies of it. It could be, a whole variety of reasons as to why it won't load. But chances are you've got, something is corrupt, and or you've got, like, say 7 different copies of the model, and so where maybe you previously had 1 million triangles, you now have, 10 million or however many. It's hard to say what exactly the issue is, but what I would try is start a brand new Blender scene and try and append just that object or just the mesh data to a new scene and see if that works to actually bring it in. I wouldn't be surprised at all if the data is still valid, but there's something else related to that data that's causing it to break. And so actually probably try bringing in just the mesh data. So basically from the file menu, you're going to start a new scene, and then you're going to go to File, Append, you're going to navigate to the file, you're going to click into it, it'll expose all the Blender data, you'll click on Meshes, and then figure out which mesh is the one that you were working on. That won't, and then you'll click Append, that won't actually load it into the scene. That will just load the data into the Blender file, and then you can change the data source on any object within your scene to showcase that data. And you'll do that via the object data properties, which is the little vertex, or the triangle icon in your toolbar properties. That will probably work. If that doesn't work, it's hard to say.
Just kind of looking over the questions that we have. Like I said, I've been trying to answer as many as I can in the comment section. One question was, if this is a Viking, where's the Viking's beard?
Where is it? Oh, it is right. I may have deleted it from this model, or for this version. Let's see. Where is that? Oh, there they are. They are scaled super tiny. There's the Viking beard indeed. So apparently at some point I rescaled the model while I was working on it for one reason or another, and I only scaled the part that I currently needed. Yes, the Viking should have a beard, and he does. All right, we're going to give it just like another, say, 5-10 minutes, and then we'll go ahead and close out. I do appreciate everybody sticking around, particularly through our couple of crashes and tests. I am amazed at Kent and the rest of the team's chance. Oh, by the way, I made a mistake, which I'm going to tell you what I did here in just a moment. It'll become abundantly clear as soon as this activates.
There was one question about if you would be able to talk a little bit more about how you were working on the eye.
Yeah.
That was done really quickly, and they wanted to have a little more explanation.
Yep. So I did a stupid thing. This is why this is taking really long. Is I had my source object as my target. And since I have multiple objects in my scene, basically what it's trying to do is it's going in and trying to render the entire source object. Or no, I have multiple copies. What did I do? Well, here, let me just get in. I'm just going to start a new one. All right. What did I do? There we go. So on the eyes, basically what I was doing is I was using a combination of polystrips and the strokes tools. So the polystrips basically I use for outlining, in this case, what I was always call the raccoon mask. Basically, your strip of polygons above the eyes, around the brow, and across the cheekbones. And so if we just go in here, let me just drop in a little stroke. There is a little hint in RetopoFlow that we use, or not a hint, but a little technique to make navigation a lot easier, is we are basically using a fake rotate around selection system, where we're actually using Blender's rotate around selection, but basically every time that you create new geometry, it basically takes that current selection, like here, copies it to another object, and uses that as your selection within Blender so that we can actually rotate around your object and keep track. Because since we're doing everything within BGL or Blender OpenGL, it doesn't actually enable us to use a lot of the default Blender functionality, things like updating selection. Did I describe that correctly, John? Or close enough?
Yeah, that's close enough.
Cool. Let me re-enable symmetry. There we go. And I'll redraw this. So basically what we're going to do, and for a little bit more speed, if you have your symmetry visualization on edge or face, it basically draws this line down the center or fills the entire area in. It is a bit of a performance hit, particularly when you're trying to do a dual live stream or a dual screen share as well. So if you just disable that, it will draw much quicker. So basically all you're going to do is you're going to create your loop around the brows. I'm going to just do this clean. So you're going to do, say, a stroke like this. Maybe scale this down a little bit. You'll rotate around. You'll do another one around the outside socket. and then you'll bring one in across the bridge of the nose. And then you want to fill this section here. So in this case, all I did was use polystrips for all of that. So polystrips enables you to draw onto and off of other faces, and it will automatically connect those as necessary. And so now what I have is this basically, loop of faces surrounding the eye socket. And all I want to do is I want to just extrude this inwards. So I can use the strokes tool, select this entire loop, including that last edge, so that I have a closed selection. And you'll notice it's made up of 12 edges. And then all I'm going to do is draw a circle around the eye. And that will basically extrude it inwards. So I'll just start drawing here. I'll draw around, come back, and then I just want to close it off, say like that. And it extrudes the whole thing in. And then I can increase my segments. And then this is also a very good time to use the relax brush and go in and just kind of relax these together, smooth it out, and I very quickly extruded that section. This is also probably a good time to create a little bit more density in here. So I could use my loop tool, put in a stroke like that, bring that in. And this is a pretty common mesh structure for a human face like this. It's really common to basically you want to have loops around the eyes in a full circle. You want a semicircle loop around the eye socket, basically, and then you'll extrude these edges here downward, say something like that, which again we can use the strokes tool and do that. And that's a lot of that. I don't want to get too deep into today as far as into overall topology flow and structure and what your mesh should actually look like. RetopoFlow will not teach you that. It just makes creating it a lot easier. And we do have on CG Cookie, there is a whole set of training that will help you with that. The Introduction to Retopology course will help with that a good bit. Many of Kent's classes, like he did a character modeling class. We've got multiple character modeling courses. Basically, every single one of those that touch organic modeling in some way will talk about the topology structure. So if you're not familiar with topology structure, those are the courses to take. And then once you are comfortable with that, then RetopoFlow makes it a lot easier to actually create. You can, of course, if I would imagine that actually having this would make it a lot easier to learn as well, because you don't have to spend nearly as much time worrying about the technicalities of how to create the geometry on the surface while also trying to create good geometry. But that may just be me being biased.
One more thing I'd like to add. Every one of the tools has a lot more features than what we've demoed today. But you can get more information, right? There's a help system. We have two different helps. One is kind of a general. It applies to all of RetopoFlow. And it just gives information about, how do you select everything? What's the shortcut key for maximizing the view area, that type of a deal. About symmetry and so forth. And then we have tool-specific help. So the tool-specific help depends, or it gives you help on whichever tool you currently have selected. So if you want some more information about contours, select the contours tool and then hit the tool help button, or you can press the F2 key on the keyboard, and that'll show up the tool. And so it'll give some information about how to use it. So if you need a quick reminder of what keyboard shortcut was to do this or to do that, you can hit that button. Of course, we're going to be coming out with tutorials, as addressed earlier, eventually, which will be more in depth. But the helps are there to help you go through and learn about what sort of features are available.
And in particular, one of the things that a lot of people have run into already is there are some key tool workflow differences between version 1 and version 2. And so if you have used version 1 in the past and are trying to get started in 2.0 and discovering that something doesn't work, or you think something doesn't work, chances are that's covered in the tool help. The main thing that actually has caught up a lot of people already is simply that all drawing is done with control click drag, not just click and drag on the tool. And the reason that we did that is since we are handling everything as a mode, and that all the tools work side by side, we also have to support selection of, adding to selection, smart selection, loop selection, removing from selection. All of these things have to happen side by side. And the moment that we tried to do everything just on, let's say, one selection mouse, or just say draw on the left mouse or something, it started getting far more complicated. And my control key keeps sticking on my keyboard. So we ended up changing it to be control click. So for example, in Polypan, if you hold down control, it will pre-visualize your mesh. If you go to polystrips, if you left click and drag, it doesn't actually do anything, because left click and drag is basically tweak transform for any of your selected strips. So if I have, say, like this, if I can get my keyboard to stop unsticking or to stop sticking. So if I have this select and I left click and drag, I'm tweaking the entire stroke. Or if I grab the handle, I grab just that one handle. If I want to add a new stroke, I hold down control, left click and drag from wherever, and it will add in the new stroke. So in order to get all the tools to work side by side, we had to make some changes within the workflow. And so if you are a 1.0 user and your tools don't draw, don't worry, it's not actually a bug, it's just a workflow change. In the future, one of the things that we hope to add is actually full customizable key map support. It is technically customizable already if you jump into the Python code. If anybody wants to do that and would like some guidance, we'll be happy to tell you. We don't tend to make those things public because it's also a very good way to break your add-on if you change the wrong file. So we don't tend to encourage doing that. But if you're game and you recognize that you can break things and you may just have to reinstall, then by all means. So right now, all of the hotkeys are basically set within Python. But long term, we would like to expose those hotkeys either via the input section or within the actual add-on panel itself, like here, and enable you to change those on your own. And that would include, in particular, the ability to support both left and right-click select options. Right now, RetopoFlow actually forces you to use right-click select. It doesn't matter what your Blender setting is at the moment. Selection is just done with right-click in RetopoFlow. In 1.x, we did have support for going left or right-click, and we'll definitely work towards that. But we had to make some decisions while we were building 2.0 because it's very large and complicated, and there's a lot going on. So with that, unless there's any last questions, I think we will go ahead and wrap up. I am very thankful for all your time. Thanks for bearing with us. And every time that I do one of these live streams, I have a new appreciation for what Kent and the rest of the content crew are doing on a weekly basis, because the demo effect is very, very real. And every time you think it won't happen, and it happens, and that's okay. So with that, thank you, everyone. This is RetopoFlow 2.0. You can get it on the Blender Market. If you have any questions, let us know. You can send pre-sale questions via the RetopoFlow product page on the Blender Market. On the right side, there's basically a pre-sale questions thing where you can just click send us a message. If you're an existing customer, simply log into your account and go to the inbox, and you can send us a message for support. If you find a bug, simply click the report issue link on RetopoFlow itself, and that will open up GitHub and allow you to actually log an issue. We do ask that if you do log an issue, please give us as much information as you can. Any steps to replicate the issue, any files that you might have that showcase the issue, all that kind of stuff. The one thing that we do request on the GitHub is please don't make feature requests. We typically will do that through the inbox, where if you have a feature that you really want, let us know, and by all means, we're all ears. But we try to keep GitHub only listed for either confirmed bugs that we are